When we meet up with Jesus and his disciples, today in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 13, Jesus is coming off a rough patch. It starts when the Pharisees condemn Jesus and his itinerant disciples for eating grain from the field on the Sabbath when they're hungry. Then when Jesus heals the man with a withered hand in the synagogue, also on the Sabbath, the Pharisees conspire to destroy him, starting with the smear campaign, calling him Beelzebub, ruler of the demons. And it gets more ugly from there. Everywhere he goes, Jesus preaches, teaches, and embodies God's love, healing, and compassion for the poor and outcasts, the stranger, the sick, and the sinner. But no matter how much good news Jesus has to share about the inbreaking of the kingdom of heaven, the majority of people he encounters treat him with suspicion, hostility, and resistance. Imagine how frustrated Jesus was at this point. Our gospel reading from Matthew today seeks to make meaning of and explain why the Son of God is received with such misunderstanding by some, indifference, or downright malice by others. Most of us might recognize the gospel passage we read today as the parable of the sower. But today I want to suggest we consider a new title, the parable of the soil. In this interpretation, Jesus is the sower and we are the soil. The sower went out to sow, Jesus begins. And then he describes these different kinds of soil. Seed sown on the path falls on a hardened, compacted, impervious surface where nothing can grow in the soil, so the seed is eaten up by birds. Then seed sown on the rocky ground withers away after it germinates and sprouts because the soil is too eroded and thin to support roots of the seedlings. Seed sown among thorns is choked out by invasive weeds and vines that thrive on highly disturbed soil. But seed sown on good earth, healthy, rich, fertile soil, flourishes into an abounding and plentiful harvest. While it is God's gracious initiative to sow seeds of love, mercy, and grace in our lives, God also gives us the gift of free will to respond to and receive such seeds based on how we tend the soil of our hearts, minds, bodies, and spirits, and that of our neighbor and community. Soil is such a perfect and resonant symbol for Israel's receptivity to Jesus, especially since the original hearers of the parable in the first century that lived in an agrarian society lived and died based on the health of the soil. And we actually do today also, we're just not nearly as aware of it. And today most of us actually think of soil as inanimate dirt. But soil, good soil, is bursting with life. A single teaspoon of healthy soil contains billions of good bacteria, miles and miles of fungi filaments, and an estimated 10 to 50,000 species of microorganisms. That's 1 teaspoon. These life forms create highly dynamic and complex habitats and ecosystems that support clean air and water, regulating the overall health of our environment and climate, sequestering vast amounts of carbon. Soil is not only living, soil is the source of all life. 95% of the food we humans eat is grown in soil. The word for humanity comes from the same Latin root as the word humus, or organic matter. And in Hebrew, the word for humankind, Adam, comes from the same root as earth. We are earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We are soil. And the quality of our lives, both as individuals and as society, is a literal reflection of how we cultivate and care for the earth that supports and sustains life on our planet. In Jesus' explication of the parable, Jesus uses these various metaphors of inhospitable, infertile soil to represent those who are shut down to and willfully misunderstand God's purposes, those who are superficial and lack authenticity, those who are self-absorbed by their wants and fears. And we've all been there, right? It's part of our human experience. Jesus likens such resistance to the situation encountered by the prophet Isaiah centuries ago, where the people of Israel, whose hearts had grown dull, ears were hard of hearing, and eyes were shut to God's repeated overtures to heal, restore, and deliver them from exile. Such has been the experience of God throughout salvation history in the Bible. What I find so compelling about this parable is the way we tend both our literal and spiritual soil. It's not just about us. It's not just about how receptive we are to God at work in our lives as individuals. The state of our soil reflects how we relate to each other as a society, how we treat one another, especially those on the margins. The condition of our soil reflects the health of our relationships. When we abuse and violate the soil of the earth and of our souls, not only do we oppose God's love and care for us, we degrade and destroy the very fabric and livelihoods of our neighbors, community, and environment. And this summer, I've read a couple of books about the Dust Bowl, and I really find the Dust Bowl to be just like a perfect case study for this parable about the devastating consequences of what happens when we don't take care of our soil. As many of you probably know, the Dust Bowl is the worst human-made ecological disaster in American history, occurring in the drought-stricken Great Plains of the South and Central United States in the 1930s, also called the Dirty 30s. This was a crisis of human greed and exploitation of the land and its people. Before white settlers arrived with the steel plow, the Great Plains were covered by a vast ocean of tall and short grass prairies, anchored in highly fertile, nutrient-rich, loamy, dark soils that evolved over thousands of years to be one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. Grazing by native buffalo and periodic wildfires that were managed by the indigenous populations for centuries ensured the resilience of these soils by sustaining their perennial root systems that absorbed and filtered water, withstood erosion due to wind and drought, and grew enough food to support all the people and wildlife that lived on these plains. When the United States began its westward expansion in earnest after the Civil War, the government systematically stole these lands from the native tribes, displacing the people through violent conquest and erasing their ancestral knowledge of how to manage this unique landscape. Ill-equipped white settlers began to ruthlessly use the plow to bust and break up the ancient prairie soils to plant the cash crop of wheat, a shallow rooting annual. And they were convinced, because they were told, that the plow follows rain, the rain follows plow, so they just believed it would always be this way, and they would just be making tons of money. Within 50 years, though, they had destroyed the prairie, replacing it all with wheat. And when a multi-year drought struck the Great Plains, as it does, the wheat crop failed. Without the perennial prairie root system holding it in place, black blizzards of soil that had taken thousands of years to form were blown away in less than a decade. The seizing and squandering of soil by white colonists led to catastrophic consequences for society and the environment. The sower's seeds cannot grow in such degraded and depleted earth. The good news is that we have the choice and the ability to restore and build good, healthy, fertile soil. What is good soil from Jesus' perspective? Well, as he says repeatedly, you will know them by their fruits. Simply put, those who are open and responsive to the good news of God's love and justice made known in following Jesus. The fruits of which he describes in the Sermon on the Mount. He gives us a vision of divine seed germinating and flourishing in good soil. Jesus paints a picture of inexhaustible blessing and provision for the lost, the lonely, and forgotten. A world where the poor and the persecuted inherit the kingdom of heaven, where those who mourn are comforted, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are filled, those who are merciful receive mercy. For Jesus and for us, this is God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. I also just watched a documentary on the life of Fannie Lou Hamer, renowned civil rights activist. Oh, what an amazing woman. And I know she's turning over in her grave after the recent decisions about the Voting Rights Act, because she was instrumental in making that happen. But one thing I didn't know about Fannie Lou Hamer is that in 1969, she founded the Freedom Farm Cooperative on 40 acres of prime Delta land in her home of Sunflower County, Mississippi. This was a deeply impoverished, rural, majority black county of sharecroppers, all of whom were descendants from enslaved people who worked the cotton plantations and whose ancestors had all been stolen from their own native soil, brought to work and forced to work without pay for centuries in this country. Sunflower County had one of the highest rates of starvation at that time. And Hamer had a passionate vision that in order to pursue political power and liberation, the black community had to be self-sufficient, which meant owning and cultivating their own land, their own soil, growing their own food, and creating opportunities for economic security. According to African-American environmental justice professor Monica White, the Freedom Farm Cooperative that ended up growing to be 680 acres included a pig bank, a Head Start program, community gardens, a commercial kitchen, a garment factory, a sewing cooperative, a tool bank, and low-income affordable housing as strategies to support the needs of African Americans who were fired and evicted for exercising their right to vote. While growing healthy, abundant food, providing work, education, and housing for poor black families, this cooperative provided training in voter registration and mobilization. White goes on to say that Hamer's cooperative became the gold standard and model for collective agency and community resilience, founded and based on the stewardship and cultivation of the land. Fannie Lou Hamer showed us what is possible on good soil, blazing the trail for the modern black community farming and food justice movements, and giving us a glimpse of the kingdom of heaven. Friends, we are the soil. We are the soil in which Christ plants the seeds of God's kingdom. We can choose to become a Dust Bowl or a Freedom Farm cooperative. And we all pray that we can become the latter. That the soil we tend here at St. Paul's is living and life-giving. That it supports the common welfare and mutual flourishing of our city, yielding an abundant, diverse, organic, and sustainable harvest that is shared by all, that creates connection, resilience, rootedness, and wholeness in the face of suffering and injustice in our community and in all creation. So, let's go out and make some good soil, people. Amen.